All right, now we're probably going to talk about one of the most fun aspects of the game, and that is the hazards. So, before we get into the actual hazards themselves, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the placement of the hazards. They will be placed according to your barge schematics, or they will be placed according to your own discretion. So to start the bout, not all barge hazards are necessarily going to be placed out in the arena. Some of them, like the floor spikes and the floor saws, will only be triggered and will appear on the arena once they are triggered. And also you have some hazards that aren't hazards until the players do something to turn them into hazards, such as the braziers. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk real quickly about the hazard activation types. So you have hazards that are always active. You have hazards that are activated by a turning point roll duplicate. You have hazards that are player activated, and then you have hazards that are activated on a turning point. Now, by player activated, what I mean is the helot has to be commanded to do something in order for the hazard to be activated, such as bust open the weapon crate or kick over the brazier. When more than one hazard is triggered at once, let's say you have a turning point roll duplicate and you're playing with both floor saws and floor spikes, you're going to do that in whatever order the cards are arranged. So that's, again, up to your discretion. You can put the cards in whatever order. You can just grab the cards and set them down. But whatever order the cards are in when the trap is activated, that's the order that you go through the traps. Any damage done by any of the hazards always goes to the crowd pile. There is one exception. If your helot, or a helot for that matter, does something to directly cause that hazard damage, such as throwing, pushing, or dragging another helot into that hazard, then that very first instance of hazard damage is paid to the Lanista of the helot that caused the damage. Now, what I mean by the first instance is you could have a situation where you take a helot and you drag them into floor spikes, and through the process of calculating the damage of floor spikes, there's a chance that that helot may be thrown back into the floor spikes and take additional damage. Well, that additional damage would then go to the crowd pile. Another example would be a hazard causing another helot to bleed or be in the flaming state. So that damage at the beginning of their action round would be paid to the crowd pile, not the helot that was inflicting the damage. If the attacking helot threw a helot into the fire, that initial 5 damage would go to the helot dragging or throwing the other helot into the fire. I hope that makes sense. So that's some precursory information about all the hazards. So let's dive into the specific hazards and what they do and how they're activated. The first one I want to talk about is the brazier. When you approach a brazier with your helot, you can, and even at an angle, you can knock the brazier over for one action point. And what that does is that tips over the brazier, and then you'll notice the fire is removable on them. That fire would then go into the square opposite of where your helot was standing in relation to the brazier. So this would land here, or if you were at an angle, it would land at the opposite 45-degree angle, but basically just across from wherever your helot knocks the brazier over. Now, once that happens, the brazier becomes an obstacle and the floor is now on fire. And what this does is whenever a helot enters any square around that fire, they're going to take 1 damage every time they enter or rotate in any of the squares around the fire. They do not become flaming. The only way a helot will become flaming is if they walk directly into the fire. Then what you're going to do is you're going to place that fire on the helot's base while it's standing there, and you now have a flaming helot. When a helot is flaming, you're going to take that flaming status indicator and you're going to place it in your area command panel. Now your helot's going to take that 1 damage at the beginning of each of your command rounds. So as your helot is now moving around the arena, it is taking this fire with it. If you don't have room on the helot space, or you just don't want to deal with it, you can now remove the fire from the board because you have that flaming state indicator on your area command panel. But once this helot stops, drops, and rolls, the fire is essentially removed from the board. Another thing to keep in mind is that when there is fire on the board and it hasn't caught another helot on fire, so that fire still exists on the board, whenever there is a turning point roll duplicate, you are going to roll a directional die for each of the flames on the board, and you're going to move the flame in that direction. So rolling southeast, you would then take the flame and you would move it into the southeast square if that square is available. If there's a destructible object in the way, and again, when you look in the obstacle section, it'll let you know which objects are destructible. But blood, for example, guts, the crates, those are all destructible objects. If the fire moves on top of a destructible object, then that object is going to be removed from the board. If a fire moves towards an indestructible object, then that fire will just remain where it is. The only time you will re-roll a fire falling into an indestructible object is if there is an indestructible object where that fire was originally kicked down. So let's say your helot was standing over here and it kicked the brazier down into this column. Well, this column's an indestructible object, so what you would do is, using that as the center, you would then roll to see where the fire would move from there. In this case, it would be north, so I'd place the fire here. Destructible, indestructible objects are important to keep in mind when you're talking about the hazards out on the board, because you will oftentimes have hazards collide or run into each other, and you'll need to know what to do when that happens. So with the fire from a brazier, this will destroy a destructible object, and in the case of an indestructible object, it just won't move at all. So the next hazard that we're going to talk about is going to be the crates. The crates are an interesting hazard in that they're not directly doing any damage to a helot unless a helot interacts with it. There is a chance that a crate could help the helot. There is a chance that the crate could hurt the helot. Those chances are determined by the crate table that you'll find at the bottom of your crate card. So you're going to roll 2d6, and depending on what you roll, that's going to tell you what happens. The majority of the time, it's going to be something good for your helot, but there is a rare occasion where your roll may have something unfortunate happen to your helot, such as a bomb. Your helot will immediately take 5 random location damage, which is pretty severe. But in order to get in and roll on that table, what you're going to do is you're going to approach the crate. Your helot needs to have the crate directly in front of it. You cannot attack the crate at an angle. And then by spending 3 action points, you will destroy that crate. And once that crate is destroyed, you will roll on the table. A very common thing to happen once you destroy that crate is that your helot will get a weapon card. If it does draw a weapon card, that weapon is immediately armed on your helot. You don't have to equip it. You don't start with it holstered. You start armed with that weapon as soon as it comes out of the crate. And remember, if for whatever reason you don't want that weapon for absolutely no action points, you can just drop it to the ground and remove it from the game. Where things get kind of fun is when we start talking about the floor saws and the floor spikes. These are both very similar hazards. We'll start with the floor saws first. Actually, let's start with the floor spikes first. Floor spikes are activated on turning point roll duplicates. What that means is if you roll a turning point and you already have a coin in that slot, that's a turning point roll duplicate. So when that happens at the beginning of your command round, you're going to place floor spikes somewhere out on the board. How do you figure out where they're going to spawn? You roll the 2 location dice. That's the green and the orange D8. You're going to roll them. It's going to correlate with the green and the orange numbers on the board, and you're going to line up that location. So, for example, I got a 1 and a 7. So we've got the 7 right here. Sorry, there's a little glare from my lights. And then there's the 1. So this is actually going to land right here. Now, if the floor spikes come up and there is nothing there, then you will leave those floor spikes right there for the duration of the bout. Now, with the floor spikes, if they land directly underneath a helot, that helot is going to lose its weakest lower appendage. If a helot is thrown into floor spikes, or falls or slips or lands in floor spikes, then that helot's going to take 10 random body location damage. And it will be bleeding. You will put the bleeding status on that helot. Only if the floor spikes spawn directly underneath where a helot is standing will a helot lose its weakest lower limb. If there is a destructible object there, that object's going to be removed from the board and replaced with the floor spikes. If there's an indestructible object there, then those floor spikes do nothing. They don't appear anywhere on the board. For example, if the floor spikes were to spawn underneath one of these columns, you would just simply leave them off the board and nothing happens. Now, what happens when you run out of floor spikes? You only have 4. They're on the board. You don't roll for them anymore on the turning point roll duplicates. What happens though is once there is a turning point, an actual turning point, somebody achieves a turning point, you are going to then relocate all the floor spikes on the board. So if you have 2 sets of floor spikes or 4 sets of floor spikes, no matter how many floor spikes are on the board when a turning point is achieved, you're going to re-roll the location for all of those floor spikes on that turning point. From what we've talked about so far in the rules, you can see why the turning points are such a big event. And when I talk about your turning point bonus for your helot, I say, if you survive your turning point, you're then free to spend your command points. Turning points can get pretty crazy in this game, and they're a lot of fun. Okay, we've talked about the floor spikes. Now let's talk about the floor saws. These are my favorite hazard. Again, these are activated on a turning point roll duplicate. One different thing that you're going to do is once you roll for that random location and you place that random location, you're then going to roll the directional die and one of the D8s. That's going to tell you what direction and how many squares that floor saw is then going to move. So I rolled east and 1. Well, the east of the board is here in this wall, and I'm going to move this floor saw 1 square to the east. Well, that's going to drive it into the wall. The wall is an indestructible object. When a floor saw meets an indestructible object, it explodes. It sends shrapnel from where that square that it landed in a 1 square radius around it. That's going to do 5 random location damage to any helot that happens to occupy one of those squares. Now, if a floor saw hits a destructible object, such as a crate, guts, or blood, then that object is removed from the board. If a floor saw should happen to hit a helot directly, that's going to be 10 random body location damage. If a floor saw completes its movement in its direction without running into any indestructible objects, then that floor saw will remain there until the end of the bout. Keep in mind, a floor saw can run through more than 1 destructible object on its path. So if you have 2 helots or 3 helots or even 4 helots lined up in its path, it will go through all of those helots. Here's a special thing to keep in mind. The floor saws may remain on the board. So it is possible for one floor saw to run into another floor saw. And it's also possible for a helot to be standing in the vicinity of when that happens. Well, you're going to do that 5 random body location damage for both of those floor saws. And just like with the floor spikes, the floor saws also put a helot in the bleeding state, whether it's the shrapnel or a direct hit. Something else to keep in mind, with both floor saws and floor spikes, like I said, they're going to remain on the board. You are going to have situations that are going to occur where a floor saw or a floor spike will have a helot occupying the same square. Now, that helot cannot remain in that square with the floor saw and the floor spike. So what do? Well, you're going to roll that directional die, and you're going to put the helot in whatever direction you roll. I happen to roll south, which would put this helot safely away from the floor spikes. But what if I roll north into this wall? Well, then this helot falls back into the floor spikes, again taking 10 random body location damage. This will persist until the helot falls into a safe area. If this helot were to fall into the floor saw next to it, it would take the 10 random body location damage. Many fights have been ended with a helot flopping around into the same trap after being bounced off of columns or walls or even other helots. This helot has to have a free place to fall. What if this helot falls into a blood tile? Well, you're going to roll to see which way it slides on that blood tile, and if it's back into the floor spikes, then it's back into the floor spikes. This can be a lot of fun. It gets big laughs in the table when something like this happens.